Hello and welcome back. We're at part 4 of the video, and in this video we're going to pass in some parameters to the modal so that you can use the same UI to edit and create objects. So first of all, we're going to add a new property to our modal called initial values, and what we're going to do is we're going to use that modal info object we created in an earlier video, and we're going to pass in the data, basically the item from this list, which represents the one we want to edit. So we're going to add a click event onto our Ion label, because if you click on the label, we want to call a new function called handle edit, and we will pass in the item that we get from the v4 above, and that will be where we will destructure the data from that object and pass it on to the edit function. So let's copy the same format from handle delete, just clean up the comment, handle edit, pass in the item, going light on the TypeScript, so we're just going to say any. And let's make sure we add the function down here, put it underneath the proper section in the return, our handle edit. And what we want to do here inside of handle edit is we want to make sure we say show the modal. So we're going to set the property, show modal true, and then on the modal info data, we will pass in the item object. And they will get passed to the modal dialog as the initial value property. So that seems pretty straightforward. Now let's transition over to my simple modal. And here in the simple modal, we'll create a new property called initial values, and we'll just set it to an empty object. Now let's clean this UI up a bit. And now we're going to switch this from a ref, which probably should have been reactive from the beginning, but let's set it as reactive now. And then we have kind of the basic fields that we need, which is the title, description, and the due date, which are set to blank. And then now we need to set the initial values coming in as a property to our form info, but we also want to be able to determine if we're in edit mode or not. So if you remember the last video, we created a computed function to calculate the items that were displayed. What we're going to do here is, just so the UI is cleaner, we're going to create a computed property called in edit mode, which basically says if the initial values get passed in and I have an ID, then that means I'm working with an existing object, and if I'm working with an existing object, then I'm editing that existing object. So all this is going to do is just return true or false if I have initial value ID. And I'm typing it all out with the ternary operator so that it's very clear that the value is being set to true or false. We get the squiggly line because I need to pass the in edit mode property back, and let's do like we did in the home view, and let's put some nice comments around it. So we have our functions in one section and our properties in another section, and the property we're going to add down the bottom here is kind of in edit mode, which we want to have access in the UI also. So now we have it down there, and we should have access to the UI. Okay, so we have our in edit mode property set up. So what else do we want to do here? We want to be able to determine when a property is getting passed in. This was a little bizarre for me, but this is the approach that I'm using. If someone knows a better approach, please leave a comment. So what I'm doing is I'm basically going to watch the initial values property, and if the initial values property changes, and if I'm in edit mode, then I'm going to take whatever properties are getting passed in, I'm going to assign them to my reactive property form info, which will then make them automatically appear in the dialog box. So that's kind of the little hack magic that I'm doing. Watch the properties. If properties change and we're in edit mode, assign properties to form, render in form, edit, and save. That's the trick. Like I said, if someone knows a cleaner way to do this, feel free to drop a note in the comments below. But that's what we're doing. Okay, so we now will have our properties set appropriately. Let's go up to our UI. As I said, our title, description, and due date will get set. Let's fix that error, that ref to reactive, clean it up. Let's get our compile. Our compile is working straight. We have our computed, just double checking everything. We have our initial values. And so now let's clean up how this event gets emitted back to the parent. So in the past, all I had to do was determine if it was canceled or not, and I could handle that with the simple true false. But now we have a bunch of different scenarios. A switch might be helpful, but I'm just going to use a if statement. So we have the scenario if it's canceled. We have the scenario if it's in edit mode. And remember, since we're inside our script, we need to unwrap that edit mode and get the value. And then the last one is, so if it's not canceled and if it's not in edit mode, then I'm creating a new object. And so I just need to send back the data. So let's put some comments in here so this is clear. And we're going to move this down below to try to be a little bit more efficient with what we code. And I think the approach we're going to take here is we're going to define, since emitting the event is a consistent thing and the only thing that changes is the actual payload that gets sent, we're going to define a payload object, and we'll set the payload object to the appropriate values based on the state. So, and then at the end, we'll just pass the payload back with the emit. So, what we're going to do here is the payload, if canceled, is canceled is true, and the form info is null. If I'm in edit mode, we're going to have a little bit of a different payload. So let's just copy this guy down, and let's paste this in. Instead of the form info being null, let's move that. Alright, so we paste them all in straight. So in edit mode, if the form info is, I'm getting confused here. Okay, when creating, by default, the form info is just whatever was in the form. I'm just going to pass it back. I'm going to destructure it, pass it back. It's the same as creating a new object and send that object back. Now, if I'm in edit mode, it's a little bit different because I have an ID. So I need to, as I'm doing below, I need to pass back all the info from the form. And I also need to make sure that I pass the ID back that was passed in. Like so. Now we get the ID sent back. And now that I'm thinking about this, there might be another way to do this. But let's just run with this for now, because I know this works. I've tested all this stuff before I did the video. And then at the bottom here, as I said, we emit the event and we pass the payload, and the payload was structured appropriately based on the behavior of the user when they're using a dialog. Okay, and then I think the last thing we want to do is after the event is emitted, I need to clean up the UI. So let's just take the same object assigned from above, and we're going to clear out the form fields by assigning it to empty. We're going to copy all this. We're just going to set everything to an empty string. So let's paste that in there, and that should get what we get. So I think everything looks good for now. It's compiling. It says no issues found. Let me eyeball this. Everything looks fine. And now let's see if we can test this thing. As I said, I found some issues using Safari, so I switched my browser to Chrome. And now let's try testing this with Chrome. I also noticed that I hadn't updated my is canceled. So is canceled clearly is false when you're in edit mode and also when you're in creating mode. So let's switch all those to false. And let's see what we get. Alright. So let's reload this guy, add an item, enter some data. I'm not the best typer, but this is just dummy data. Done. Save. Alright, we get our data in. When I edit it, I just click the item because that's the edit event. I change the title and I save it. Oh, that's not right. It looks like it's duplicating my object. So what's going on? See, those two object IDs are the same. So what did I do wrong?
So that's a new data.
I want to save. We get the ID set. Cancel. That looks right. The bug is around the edit and saving. So let's go back and look at the code inside of my home view. So event data form ID. And yeah, basically I was just saving in all scenarios. In some scenarios I update, in some scenarios I save. So basically if the data that I'm getting back actually has an ID on it, then I want to find the object inside of my map and I want to update it. And since set will either update or insert, all I need to do is just call the same code, which is list data set, except the difference is that I'm not going to construct an ID. I'm going to use the ID that got passed back, and that should be the event data form ID. So I use event data form ID. I set it on the set, and that should update the object that got passed in. And since everything's there, what am I doing? I'm missing. That looks right, that looks right. We're at home view 89. Let's see what's going on. That all looks good. That looks right, that looks right.
Right, so
I hate this, that error just kind of says one thing, but it's probably something somewhere else, like a missing bracket. And that's exactly what it is. There's a red squiggly, but now where do I need to add this guy to get everything back straight? Let's put it right here and see what we get. That solve it? Looks like that solved it. Okay, let's try again. Let's add an object. Object added. Add another object. Object added. Two different IDs. Cancel. Cancel. That looks right. Cancel. Cancel. That looks right. When I'm editing it, it shouldn't be doing that. So what was going on? Let's see. So what's happening is I wasn't deleting the leftover ID that was in the form info object. So it was not working properly. So what I needed to do is, after I actually create the object, make sure I clean up the form appropriately, including the ID. Because sometimes you get an ID and sometimes you don't. So that's what the problem was. So let's see, this seems to be working correctly now. Add item, cancel, cancel, add item. No, let's see, when I add it, if the bug is fixed, it should be added. It shouldn't just update it. Done. Save, object added. So it looks like we wrapped it and delete is working successfully. So what we're going to do in the next video is, I think we're going to take this list map that we have and we're going to start saving stuff to Firebase. Make sure you like and subscribe. See you next time.